So our special guest today is Professor Ato Quayson. Good morning, Professor Quayson, and good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. So Professor Ato Quayson is Professor of English at Stanford University, where he has been since 2019. Prior to that, he held appointments at the University of Cambridge, the University of Toronto, and NYU. He has also had fellowships at the University of Oxford, Harvard, and the Australian National University. Professor Quayson studied for his undergraduate degree at the University of Ghana, then went on to the University of Cambridge for his PhD. He has written 6 monographs and 9 edited collections. The monographs include Strategic Transformations in Nigerian Writing, Postcolonialism Theory, Practice or Process, Aesthetic Nervousness, Disability and Crisis of Representation, the book which we will talk about today, and Oxford Street, Accra, City Life, and the Itineraries of Transnationalism, which was co-winner of the Urban History Association's prize for the best book on cities in 2015, non-North America. Edited volumes include The Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature, Companion to Diaspora and Transnational Studies, and The Cambridge Companion to the Postcolonial Novel. Tragedy and Postcolonial Literature is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press in 2021. He is founding editor of the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Inquiry and a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Society of Canada, and the British Academy. He's currently president of the African Studies Association. It is such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Ato Quayson. And thank you for agreeing to this immediately.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Yes, it was such an amazing surprise.
Yes.
Yeah. So our topic
I'm honored to be invited.
Same here. So our topic today is disabled humans and life in literature. This is for the participants. If you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. They will be taken up towards the end of the session. So Professor Quayson, let's begin with the questions.
Yes, of course. Let's go.
Right.
Ready.
Right. So let us begin with a broad question, Professor Quayson. Where do you place the origin of the current understanding of disability? So are we looking at the white heterosexual full-bodied white Vitruvian man in Renaissance, or do we go further back? So even in Christology, a healthy body is a carrier of a clean soul.
Well, it's not, there are multiple sources. There are multiple sources, and different societies will have different ideas about disability or the disabled body, which then also may undergo a transformation historically. So, for example, in antiquity, the Christian, not Christians, a Jewish religion in the Old Testament did not allow certain categories of disabled bodies to make sacrifices at the altar, to approach the altar. So that disability was clearly the sign of some kind of deficit and contamination. Yeah? And a similar thing with the Greeks. Ancient Greeks, disability was always the bearer of some problematic status. Now, different cultures have different ideas about disability. Typically, physical disability is correlated with lack. So typically, so if you have one arm cut off or if you have a limp, whereas cognitive disability, madness and so on, is connected to some form of spiritual power and insight. So the two are not necessarily the same. So physical disability is some form of lack, and cognitive is often perceived that is as a kind of conduit for some spiritual force and so on. And different, so we cannot trace, and it would be wrong to trace a single genealogy. That would be a mistake.
So when we speak of disability, are we just referring to physical and psychological anomalies, or are there others as well?
Well, physical and cognitive, not psychological,
right,
are, as it were, two broad categories. So there's physical impairment, which is visible, you can see, and then there are cognitive impairments, which you do not necessarily. Some cognitive impairments manifest in physical forms, like, extreme forms of autism. It's cognitive, but you can see it gives you physical clues. But the point is to distinguish between disability and impairment. Very, very important. Because disability is socially produced. For example, let me illustrate a very simple illustration. So we are all, we have two arms and we are all fine. We're going about our business. And then you fall down and you injure your right hand. So I'm right-handed. You injure your right hand. You will suddenly discover that most doors, in fact, all doors are made for right-handed people and not left-handed people. This is a simple test. And so you suddenly see that to open a door when your right hand is injured or even broken disables you. So it's a condition of the physical environment, one. The condition of the social environment, social attitudes, two. And then also as it were, the accommodations that are allowed or not allowed. So there are social accommodations that may be allowed for people who have impairments. Once these three are put together, you become disabled. I'm using the injured hand just as a very easy and quick illustration. So you injure your right hand, you suddenly see that all doors open by the right hand. It's easier to open a door with your right hand than your left hand. Suddenly you become temporarily disabled. With people with permanent disabilities, it is the permanent impairments, the social conditions disable them. So we must always understand the social forms that disable people who have impairments.
Right. So therefore, is disability simply a social construct then, or does it also evolve from medical advancements? For example, someone using a prosthetic 3D printed or a biometric leg in a crowd might avoid that inquisitive public eye, something which was not possible, say, even 50 years back.
Yes, that's actually quite true. Medical advances ameliorate. They ameliorate the effect of disablement, because society, remember that it is partly a perceptual question, but it's partly also the capacity to function. So now we have war veterans who also are able to run the 100 meters. War veterans with prosthetic legs who are very fast on the track. They are no longer disabled because of medical advancements. But you will find that the prosthesis, if visible, though if the prosthesis is not visible, there's no way to distinguish a veteran soldier with a prosthetic leg from another person who has no prosthetic legs. If it is not visible, the source of disablement is removed. But if it becomes visible, the prosthetic leg also shows, some people will interpret it as a sign of some form of deficit. So the prosthetic leg is helpful, there's no doubt about it. And therefore that's advancement in science, it's helpful. But the social attitude that names a missing part of the body as a sign of a lack is not fully ameliorated.
Right. So let's come to the narrative aspect of it. So do you think a narrative on disability requires a specific language register?
No, it doesn't. Anyone can write about disability in literature. It doesn't need any specific language. And remember that there are also different genre conventions to talk about or to represent disability. And you can represent disability along a large spectrum of representations. So we cannot insist on a particular language to to represent disability. There are many examples. I mean, in a comedy, for example, the disability will be coded differently than in a tragedy or satirical text. So that the coding in the comedy is to generate laughter, a gentle laughter, and so on. And there are examples I could give.
Right. So could you talk about the precise moment when a contingent body encounters a disabled body? So what are the kind of reactions emerging from that confrontation?
Okay, we must also distinguish between encounters between disabled and non-disabled in the real world. So you are walking down the street and you encounter a disabled person, and representations in literature. There's a big distinction, but let me focus on the encounter in the real world. So if you've encountered the same person many, many times, so your co-worker, your colleague at the university, the many encounters will change the way you begin to, as it were, especially if they function well, they're good intellectuals and they're good workers, their disability becomes subsumed under their efficiency. So you no longer see it. So what I'm going to describe has to do with first time encounters. So not someone that you've known or maybe even grown up with, but first time encounters. On first time encounters, the disability, so let us say, give an example. So you've met someone at a function and they have one eye, they don't have an eye. So one of the eyes, left or right, is off. And there's a mark, clearly they don't have an eye. The non-disabled immediately becomes curious about the disability. And I'm using the eye because it's visible, it's clear, you cannot escape it. However, the protocols of civility, of civil exchange, prevent you from asking, hey man, what happened to your eye? You can't ask because you are, civil ink. But because the eye, the bad eye is at its where it is eliciting a question, just by the fact that it is visible, it is eliciting a question that cannot be asked. So it is automatically eliciting a question, but cannot be asked. It leads to awkwardness in the social encounter, a kind of epistemological, I wouldn't say crisis, but it's a problem of epistemology, because the I requires interpretation, but you cannot ask. So that's point one. This is on first encounter, not on 30th encounter. On first encounter, you want to ask what happened to your eye. You cannot ask because of civil arrangements. But the fact that you cannot ask doesn't prevent you from speculating. And the speculation can be of different kinds. What happened to this eye? Is this a mark of something? Was he a cat burglar and he got whacked in the eye and so on and so forth? Typically, the disability that shows itself that cannot be interrogated triggers feelings of anxiety. So out of the anxiety, you begin to populate with meanings, anxious meanings. This feature of first time encounters in the real world is almost universal. Remember, we're talking of encounters in the real world and first time, not 30th or 300th time. After 300 times, the thing begins to not be that significant. This has to be distinguished from encounters in literature. Not the same. Some of what we saw, the awkwardness, appears in literature, but in literature, the disability additionally acts as a fulcrum, a fulcrum around which other meanings are constructed. So sometimes even contradictory. So the fulcrum in the literary representation, disability acts as not always, sometimes, but not always as a single thing, but as the way in which the text proliferates different meanings around that disability. So we always have to, in other words, you cannot read literature as though you're reading a newspaper. You understand? The literature is not telling you, it's not divulging raw information to you. It's doing things because it's an aesthetic object. So you don't read a disabled character in a novel and read it as though you're reading it in the Indian Times or Times of India. That's your big newspaper, right?
It is. Yeah.
Yes. So that's how that is.
So is there a possibility of a book on disability, if there is, let's say, a book on disability, let's say your book on disability, or a literary text for that matter, assuming some sort of personhood? I mean, does it just remain a book like every other book, or does it transform into some kind of threatening other, reminding us continuously of our bodily contingency?
Well, you've fused two questions. The first question is, what can a book do? What does a book do? My book, this one, what does it do? Or a literary text that has a disability, what is its status in the world? That's a different question from the implied question of what it ought to be as a reminder of our contingency. So it's two different questions. Now, the first question, what does a book do? You can only tell by reading it. I mean, the book cannot walk around town and be knocking people on the head and saying, hey, this is disability. You have to read it. But in reading it, your responses are determined partly by what is said in the book and partly by the experiences that you bring to the book. So not everyone will read the book and get the same response. So we cannot generalize, basically, that's what I'm saying. We cannot generalize that this is what the book should or can do, because it is interactive. The meaning is produced interactively, and the meaning is partly a function of what and how it is written, but also the person's own experience. However, what it ought to do, among other things, I agree with you, it ought to remind us that ability or able-bodiedness is contingent on many factors. That is to say, we assumed when you are healthy, you're walking around, you have your kids, you are driving around and so on, you're working and so on. You tend to forget that your able-bodiedness is dependent on many, many factors. The representation of disability, part of what it does is to remind us of the contingent factors. That is like we are able-bodied because we have lots of props. We are like actors on a stage with lots of things propping us to be able-bodied. One prop is taken off, like good food, poverty. Poverty in many societies historically has been a source of disablement. So one prop is removed, and then you suddenly you verge on the verge cliffhanger of becoming disabled. War, conditions of war. Many societies that have been to war proliferate disability. Is the given, because you send soldiers out to the battlefront, they get injured. They come back, they are not who they were, able-bodied when they. So the props that enable us to be able-bodied, literature of disability and books such as mine are reminders of that we are contingent on our able-bodiedness is contingent on many, many factors.
So are you of the opinion also that a person with disability is more connected to their body because of the spasms, the thickness of the body, the inhuman vitality they suffer from? So are they more connected?
Well, you can say that because when you're going around and you're in full health, your body is supposed to be transparent to you in the sense that it doesn't remind you of anything. Whereas if you injure your finger, all your senses come to dwell on the finger. So you are chopping onions in the kitchen and suddenly you chop off half of your finger. That finger will always remind you of of the injury, so that it becomes almost like it reorients your entire being and psychology to the injury. Or a stomach ache. So you've eaten something not very good for you and you have a stomach ache. When your stomach is not aching, you never think of your stomach. It's like as you're walking around, you have no stomach because it never reminds you. But as soon as you have a stomach ache, it reminds you. In fact, a doctor will tell you that if any part of your body is reminding you of it, it means it's not well. Your ear, when you're walking around, you don't walk around thinking that, oh, I have ears. The ears just function, it's all good. But as soon as one of your ears start hurting you, you become conscious of it. So in a manner of speaking, you are right. that the disabled body, and we're talking physical as opposed to cognitive disability, they are obliged to be constantly in touch with the body, the embodiment, because the part of the body that is either absent or ailing is producing a constant set of reminders about the ailment. So we might say that I think disabled beings would agree that they have a closer proximity to the body, very close up, because they are reminded of the bindedness. Just as I said, if you have a stomach ache, you suddenly remember your stomach, and your stomach becomes a thing. You even begin to address it as though it's a human being on its own, and so on and so forth. So I think that would be accurate.
Right. There's a beautiful line in your book where you say, so every body is subject to chance and contingent events. And once this is realized, it produces a primal scene of extreme anxiety and vertiginous fears of loss of control over the body itself. Unquote. So do you think it's an accidental realization, or is it the social responsibility of literature to induce this awareness?
Well, when you read literature, as I do all the time, you're constantly reminded of contingencies. That's this, and I think it performs out, and there's a wide range of literature, and also filmic representations that make you pause, because that's the thing about literature, is that it intervenes in reality and gives you pause. It's a kind of intervention that re-illuminates. Even things that you didn't notice before become re-illuminated, but even things that you noticed and that you live your everyday life, you begin to rethink. So that's its function. The function is to ignite recognition. And the recognition may be things that you've always seen but not recognized. Literature will ignite that recognition. Or things that you never thought about, it will ignite recognition. Of course, these recognitions can be completely temporary and transient. So you read the book, let me give you a classic example. Shakespeare's Richard III. Richard III is a hunchback. So you read about, you see it performed, and you are reminded, of what conditions produce this. He's a villain, by the way, and so on and so forth. That cognition or recognition may not be permanent. So you think about it for, you are busy, you have to go to work, you have your own stomach ache, and so on and so forth. You forget about it. In addition to literature, social norms, society has to have mechanisms to remind people or able-bodied of contingency. Of the contingency of the, so literature can do something for sure, and it does do, but it cannot do the work on its own. This is the point I want to make. What about people who don't read literature? Because there are some people who don't read. So literature does do something for sure, but it cannot do it all by itself.
Right. So let us talk about texts and representations now. So how would you really define aesthetic nervousness?
Okay, let me give you, I think this is the moment when you put up the clip from Finding Nemo. Yeah. And let me preface. Because I have kids, so there was a period when they were little, I used to watch, and I like to see what they're seeing. So I used to watch. I've watched a lot. I consider myself, no one considers me, but I consider myself and a small expert on Disney and Pixar movies, because I watch them with them and I talk about it with them. We even have a discussion group now. Now they're older, they're at university, and some of them, two of them are working. But we have a WhatsApp group, and we call it a Pixar Diaries. And we talk about movies on the Pixar Diaries on our WhatsApp group and exchange messages and so on. So I've watched lots of repeated, As I was watching them, I discerned certain patterns. So when I was writing the book, researching and writing the book, I watched Finding Nemo many times, and suddenly it was almost like an epiphany. I recognized some aesthetic nervousness operating in that movie. So I want to show the example, the clip, and then I'll use that to define or lay out the principles of aesthetic nervousness. So please.
Right, yeah.
I live on this reef a long, long way from here.
Oh boy, this is gonna be good, I can tell.
And my son, Nemo, see, he was mad at me. And maybe he wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been so tough on him. I don't know. Anyway, he swam out in the open water to this boat, and when he was out there, these divers appeared, and I tried to stop them, but the boat was too fast. So we swam out in the ocean to follow
We
him.
couldn't stop him. And then Nemo's dad, he swims out to the ocean, and they bump into three
ferocious sharks. He scares away the sharks by blowing them up.
Golly, that's amazing.
And then dives thousands of feet
straight down into the dock. It's like wicked dark down there. You can't see a thing. How's it going, Bob? And the only thing I can see down there is
the knife in this big horrible creature with razor sharp teeth. Nice parry, old man. And then he has to blast his way out.
Two little fish have been searching the ocean for days on the East Australian current.
Means that he may be on his way here right now. That should put him in Sydney
Harbour in a matter of days. I mean, it sounds like this guy's gonna stop at nothing
till he finds his son. Sure hope he makes it. That's one dedicated father, if you ask me.
You rats with wings!
The bloke's been looking for his boy Nemo.
Nemo?
He was taken off the reef by divers, and this...
They're taking you, Harry! Hey, say that again. You just said something about Nemo. What was it?
Mine? Last I heard, he's heading towards the harbour.
Oh, brilliant!
Is he doing okay?
I don't know, but whatever you do, don't mention D-A-R.
It's okay, I know who you're talking about. Gil.
Hey, Sharpie.
I'm sorry I couldn't stop the...
No, I'm the one who should be sorry. I was so ready to get out. So ready to taste that ocean. I was willing to put you in harm's way to get there. Nothing should be worth that. I'm sorry I couldn't get you back to your father, kid.
Hey!
What the? Ah! Well, that's one way to pull a tooth. Huh. Darn kids. Well, good thing I pulled the right one, hey, Prime Minister?
Hey, psst.
Oh, Nigel, you just missed an extraction.
Oh, has he loosened the periodontal ligament with the elevator yet? What am I talking about? Nemo, where's Nemo? I've got to speak with him.
What? What is it?
Your dad's been fighting the entire ocean looking for you.
My father? Really?
Really? Oh, yeah. He's traveled hundreds of miles. He's been battling sharks and jellyfish, all sorts of...
That can't be him.
Are you sure? What was his name? It's some sort of sport fish or something. Tuna? Trout?
Marlin?
That's it. Marlin, the little clownfish from the reef.
It's my dad! He took on a shark!
I heard he took on 3.
Three
sharks?
There's gotta be 4,800 teeth.
You see, kid, after you were taken by Diver Dan over there, your dad followed the boat you were on like a maniac.
Really?
He's swimming, and he's giving it all he's got, and then 3 gigantic sharks capture him, and he blows them up, and then dives thousands of feet where he gets chased by a monster with huge teeth. He ties this thing to a rock. What does he get for a reward? He gets to battle an entire jellyfish forest. But now he's riding with a bunch of sea turtles on the East Australian current, and the word is he's headed this way, right now, to Sydney.
Now, for those who are familiar with the movie, and I'm going to give a small account of it for those who are not familiar. Marlin, the orange fish, is the father of Nemo, who has been captured by divers. So divers have captured Nemo, and they've sold him to a kid in Sydney. And so Nemo is in a fish tank. But this point is not what we're interested in here. Marlin is desperate, the father, Orange Fish, is desperate to find Nemo. and he encounters earlier in the story, he encounters Dory, the bluefish. Now, Dory, unfortunately, has short-term amnesia. She can't remember anything. So if you ask her name now, the next moment you ask her again, she's forgotten, or ask her what happened and so on. But it turns out that clearly she's disabled. This disability, this short-term amnesia, is very useful for her, and also useful for her to fortify Marlin. Because Marlin is a scaredy cat. He's scared of everything. He's actually paranoid. Some larger fish killed his wife. So throughout, he doesn't want to leave the reef where he has his abode. But now he has to leave. But so they team up completely inadvertently. And because Dory has no short-term memory, she cannot anticipate or remember danger. So she cannot remember danger, she cannot anticipate it since she's never had it in her memory. And because of her, as it turns out, fearlessness, she is very good as a way of strengthening Marlin. Now, the section that you just saw, the two of them have just gone through a jellyfish forest, stinging jellyfish. And they've managed to get themselves out of the jellyfish, and they wake up on the back of a school of turtles. It turns out that they are on the East Australian current, and that the turtles, the school of turtles, large group of turtles, is swimming toward, basically they're migrating. These are migrating turtles. And they get Marlin to tell his story. And this is the story that he tells. And as we see, as he's telling the story begins to have legs. So it is redacted by different fish, the swordfish and the dolphins as they go in and out of the water. And as they are talking about it, it's picked up by the birds and this thing is carried. Now, this point in the film is a very important and pivotal point because it is the point at which, they are, of course, being transported, this time not of the evolution through the East Australian current, but more importantly, it is the point at which the film pauses. The film is pausing to recount for us what we've just seen. So what we've seen up to that point is recounted by Marlin's story. However, the account that Marlin gives is an account of the adventures, excluding Dory's contribution. And so Marlin becomes a legend in his own time. The film is producing a legendary narrative, heroic and legendary narrative around Marlin in his own words, and creating it as a kind of oral memory for the film. The film is doing it itself. It has stopped narrating and has put the narrative in the mouth of the character. And he is repeating all that we've seen. Except that in what we've seen, he was a coward. It was Dory who was the one who enabled the adventures. What does this suggest? It suggests that at the precise moment when the film is producing a form of oral narrative for itself, it suffers amnesia regarding the character who has amnesia in reality in the film. So the film is producing an oral story, a memory of its own self, but in that memorialization, it forgets the character, i.e. Dory, who is herself suffers from short-term memory. Do you understand? Asijit, does it make sense?
It does make sense, yes.
It does make, okay. This is what I mean by aesthetic nervousness. The aesthetic nervousness is when the framework of representation that has been produced for us to start with. So we'll call it the dominant framework of the dominant protocol or protocols of literary representation becomes short-circuited or collapse around the figure of disability. And it's the figure of disability around that figure. Now, that figure of disability is not the agent of the collapse of the dominant protocol, but disability always produces a problem. That's what I call the aesthetic nervousness for representation. So this is one very good example. Finding Nemo has surfaced short-term amnesia only about the character who has short-term amnesia. But this is not what it did until this point. Until this point, Dory was central to the action. So Dory is central and yet peripheral at the same time. She's peripheralized at the moment when the film is producing its oral memory of itself. It is self-consciously pausing to produce a memory of itself. But in that pause to produce the memory, the memory of the disabled character is removed. This is what I mean by aesthetic nervousness. And then in the book, I have many examples of how at certain points, the disability triggers a crisis of representation. It flips the switch. It flips the switch. And what we need to be alert to is how the switch is flipped. This is a good example because it's visual, it's open, it's innocent, but there are countless examples where disability flips the switch of the narration.
I just have one added question, Professor Quayson. So when you talk of aesthetic nervousness, you're of course talking about the reader reading it, but is it also in the writer writing it, one who is trying to frame it?
I'm not talking about the reader at all. The reader, if they're not reading carefully, may not see that this is what I was trying to do, that right. That the reader reading a book with disability ought to be alert to the disability as a fulcrum of different things, so that most readers don't see it. In fact, let me tell you, the way that I got to write this book is that a student of mine, I was at Cambridge University at the time, piped up one fine day and said she had been taking a class with me, not a class, a supervision, they call it supervision with me for 8 weeks. And in 8 weeks, she piped up and said, so Professor Quayson, why is it that all the books that you have discussed with us have disabled characters in them after week 8? And I was stunned because I had not noticed. I was stunned. Really? Are you sure? She said, yeah, every single one has a disabled character. So I went back to reread the books, and lo and behold, my eyes opened to in fact, that former student is now herself a professor in Australia, and she's written a book on disability in poetry. Beautiful, beautiful book, triggered from that discussion. And so the question then that I asked myself is, why is it that I consider myself to be fairly well educated and fairly attentive to detail? Why is it that in all my readings and in teaching these texts, I hadn't noticed? And so I went back to say there is a defect in our reading practices, because our reading practices are designed not to take account of the disabled. So part of the purpose of the book is to make us more alert to the presence of disability and its function in literature. The writer may or may not, we cannot generalize. So for example, a writer who themselves have a disability will be writing with the experience in mind. But there are lots of writers who have no disability, but feel emboldened to write disabled characters. Do you understand? So the writer writing the disabled character may just be using the disabled character as a backdrop or a test for the non-disabled. It's completely common. Writers who have disability themselves when they're writing about disability, are more sensitive. So we, again, unfortunately, we cannot generalize.
Right. So why are there possibilities of aesthetic, textual, and metaphysical impasse every time a text attempts to represent disability?
Okay, I tried to, what I sought to do was to establish that principle that there's an impasse at some point. So the impasse may not start from the beginning, but at a certain point, there'll be something, the script will be flipped, as it were. To establish that, I had to also establish certain protocols of interpretation. That is to say, how do we actually, when you see a disabled character in the text, in a given text, how do you read it? Because part of the problem that I faced before the students' epiphanic question was that I actually, like most people, did not know how to read the disabled. How do you read it? Once you begin to read it, you discern. And in a way, I was trying to, generate a kind of a holistic account, which can then be used to apply to various different literary texts from very different traditions. Once you begin to pay attention to it, to learn how to read the disabled, you see that certain meanings cluster around disabled characters. And in the second chapter of the book, which I lay out as a typology, and these clusters, you can recognize the clusters, around the disabled character. But often, and this is the central principle of my argument, the narrative has a kind of, as it were, almost a nervousness in itself, because they want to treat the disabled character like the non-disabled character. But they can't, because disability is not the same as non-disability. And so this tension then triggers, and it's revealed, it's very revelatory, because it's revealed in certain wrinkles or alterations in the narratological map work of the disability. And of course, I try to make this point looking at specific examples, but I think it's fairly generalizable.
Right. So let's shift to a very favorite author of mine. So talking of Beckett, let's say Samuel Beckett. So what do you think induces the aesthetic nervousness within the texts he writes? So is it especially the kind of half-bodied eroding characters Beckett introduces, or the tectonic shifts within the writing itself?
Okay, as it happens, I love Beckett. I've written on Beckett in Aesthetic Nervousness, and there's a different chapter on Beckett in my forthcoming book, the tragedy book. Okay. Beckett, as we know, has disabled characters everywhere. Everywhere, yes. Like, and whether it's Endgame or Molloy or the novels, it's in fact, almost every work that you read of his has a disabled character in it. Yes. Now, partly because of his language use, partly because of Beckett's language use, his disabled characters have been interpreted, and this is completely standard, as ciphers of philosophical conundrums. So that the disability is not read as significant in itself. So the characters are disabled, but they are not read as disabled. They are read as, is almost like hooks for raising philosophical conundrums. I completely disagree with this reading. I try to show it a little bit in Aesthetic Nervousness. And the reason why I disagree with it is that this refuses to take account of the materiality of disability for Beckett, because this disability has a particular materiality in Beckett. In fact, his novels, the aesthetic nervousness, you can see it in places like Endgame, the aesthetic nervousness, like, for example, Ham, as we know, is confined to the wheelchair, and his prolixity, he talks a lot. His prolixity, but also the fact that he's always giving and taking back in language. So he gives and takes back. So there's a kind of a to and fro in his language and so on. But you see it more in his prose works. In his prose works, you see the work of aesthetic nervousness, like blatantly. Let me give you one example. I wrote about Molloy in this novel, in aesthetic nervousness, but in the new book, I write on Murphy. Murphy was his first novel.
Yes.
Now, Murphy is about a character called Murphy, who I argue, and I think I was I'm the first person to argue this point. I argue that Murphy is autistic. He's an autistic character. Nobody thinks he's autistic. They just think that he's odd, he's weird. But I think his weirdness is because he's autistic. But to prove that he's autistic, I have to reread the text to sort of align Murphy's characteristics to characters on the autistic spectrum. And Murphy, to me, is blatantly autistic. First of all, when the novel opens, he has strapped himself with 7 scarves onto a rocking chair, and he's trying to rock himself into oblivion. He does that anytime he is really upset about something. As soon as I read that, I knew the guy was autistic, because autistic people often require repetition, repetition either of rhythm or patterns and so on. So, and the patterns can be numeric or alphanumeric. So an autistic character will be able to memorize number plates, car number plates and so on. It seemed to me from that starting point, but there were other things. The fact that Murphy loves patterns. Anywhere he can, he will pause and try and, like he has, is it 5 or 6 biscuits? Every day he carries the same biscuits, but the biscuits are of different kinds. So they are not the same type of biscuit. He takes those 6 biscuits for lunch. Every day he lines them up on a piece of paper on the grass in the park, lies in front of the biscuit, and tries to calculate what order he can eat them in to multiply the numerical value. Who does that? Who does that with biscuits? The guy is autistic. So he does every day, he lies down, and then he begins to calculate. So he will crunch all kinds of numbers around the biscuits. If I eat the ginger biscuits first before the chocolate biscuits, and I eat this in sequence and that in sequence, it will give me a permutation of 150. But if I eat this, every day he does that. This is an autistic character. So there are other things. However, this autistic character, so we're going along, Murphy is going, and then he takes a job in an asylum, mental, the modeling mental mercy seat. And there he encounters a schizophrenic called Mr. Endon, with whom he plays a game of chess. Now, this game of chess, I argue, is a really important, this is the moment concentration of the aesthetic nervousness in the novel. So the autistic character meets the schizophrenic, but the autistic character assumes that the schizophrenic is the king of solitude. And he wants to be like Mr. Endon, because he desires solitude, another feature of autistic spectrum disorders. So he is wedded to the idea of being recognized by Mr. Endon, but Mr. Endon does not recognize him. And the moment of non-recognition is generated in the chess game that they play one night. And when Murphy realizes after the chess game that Mr. Endon does not recognize him, he goes into a major crisis and several things happen and he dies. Aesthetic nervousness right there for you. Beckett, right there. Beckett is wonderful for talking about disability. One, because the disabled characters, almost 90% of his works, there's a disabled character in them. Lucky, in Waiting for Godot, Lucky is disabled. He has cognitive disability. He'll be ranting and talking his long speeches out. Nobody knows what he's talking about. It's a fine sign of disability. So this is how I attempt, and Beckett is actually, I'm glad you mentioned, because Beckett is excellent for talking about disability.
Right. So we have just two more questions, perhaps. So I want to ask the dependency of bodies or minds with disorders on other people or technology. So does it somehow challenge the communitarian ideals of charity or the principles of liberal individualism that you're supposed to take care of yourself and not depend on others?
Well, the idea of the liberal individualism is it's an idea which we need to challenge at every turn.
Yes.
Absolutely. Let me give you an example from a different discourse. I've finished this book on tragedy, which, Asijit, thank you for mentioning it. And in it, I draw a lot on Aristotle. You know, Aristotle's Poetics and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But there's something that I realized, and it dawned upon me suddenly, because I've used Aristotle to teach, and that is that Aristotle's idea of tragic crisis is very individualistic. It's built on the assumption that the reversal of fortunes of the central protagonist is his or hers alone. It's fundamental, and that it has no effect on the witness community, except for mourning. So the witness community, the only effect on them is, oh, how sorry are we? How pitiful is this character? Now, this goes fundamentally against the principles in most cultures that I'm familiar with. Definitely in my African culture, the collapse of certainty around a particular character is experienced as a contamination for members of the witness-bearing community, so that there's a dialectical relationship between the defect of the character and what the community assumes is partly their responsibility. I have a concept for it, which I describe in the book. And in fact, I use this concept to also show that there's often an attendant contamination. So you are perceiving the collapse of a certain reversal of fortune of a certain figure, but you actually, or a mode of suffering, not just reversal of fortune, but extreme suffering. Just 2 days ago, I taught my graduate class, and I gave them the example of George Floyd, the Black yes. American. Mm-hmm. When that happened, my question was, why were people so outraged all over the world? Because the police in America have been killing Black people all the time. So what's new? And what was new was that now, for the first time, we've been provided a tableau. Mm-hmm. Think of it as an imagistic tableau, but it's an imagistic tableau that is inherently unjust. But that injustice or unjustness makes us feel contaminated because we cannot do anything about it. You understand? So that the witness-bearing community, which is anyone that watches it on the screen, feels bad about seeing what they are seeing, this tableau. And that feeling bad about it galvanizes people to action. Now, this seems to me to be a more supple understanding of the tragic effect than to assume that it's the individual's problem and that's the end of it. And I think that this would accord with many communalistic cultures and societies, that the fall or destruction or extreme suffering of the individual contaminates the witness bearing. And I use witness bearing because not the entire community will bear witness, but whoever sees it or bears witness to it feels themselves partially implicated, responsible at the least, so that the idea of the neoliberal individual does not actually apply, or at least it needs to be qualified in various cultures.
Right. So how do we read disability in the post-colonial context, which you also end the book with, and how is it linked to imperialism and its subjection of otherness?
Well, those are very big questions. Now, in post-colonial cultures, unfortunately, post-colonial cultures are not necessarily more enlightened than Western cultures, unfortunately, when it comes to disability. there's a lot of negativity around disability. For example, you know, in where I come from, a disabled person will be assumed to have, to bear a kind of responsibility for their disability. There is maybe because of some karma, you guys, karma is you got something bad that you did, you know, that's why your leg, one leg is shorter than the other. You were bad in a previous life and so on. Very common to blame the disabled for something that's not their fault. Oh, it's because you're an evil person. It's the disability is an insignia of your inherent evil. Unfortunately, it's very common. There's a kind of a dismissive attitude to disability. There was a big scandal in my country, in Ghana, recently, when the previous government wanted to appoint a blind man, very capable. He was a lawyer, but he was blind, as Minister for Chieftaincy Affairs. The chiefs said, "Why are you giving us a blind man as minister?" And the reason why they were so panicked, the president ignored them and still appointed a blind minister. The reason why they ignored, they were panicked is that in traditional culture, to become a chief, you have to show that all your body is intact. You cannot be a disabled, carry with disability and be a chief. In fact, to the point where you cannot be circumcised. In certain cultures, you cannot even be circumcised and become a chief. Your entire body has to be unbroken. So they're saying, why are you giving us a blind minister? And they were jumping up and down, but he ignored them and insisted. So they had a blind, for the first time, a blind, capable, he did great work. But for me, when I read it about it, I said, look at these idiots. You know, they're as it were, their negative attitude to disability are on display in the name of tradition. So unfortunately, post-colonial societies such as the African one, which I come from, that has not got the formula, the winning formula, sadly. There are laws, you know, there's ADA, not ADA, Disability Acts. Many countries have enacted Disability Acts, but the social norms around disability are not the best. Switching to imperialism and colonialism and disability, one of the ways in which colonialism actually generated and compounded the problem with disability is by taking our able-bodied men to go and fight in their stupid wars. You know, the French, idiotic wars that had nothing to do with us. You know, the French, conscripted soldiers, able-bodied men from Senegal, Mali, various African countries to go and fight with in the Napoleonic Wars. Why? Is it my father's battle? Same in the First World War, same in the Second. And what happened? When they returned, the soldiers, the injured soldiers, had no medical assistance. They were returned to their families. And so many of them suffered PTSD. My grandfather fought in the First World War. He returned home, and after a while, he lost his mind because the British imperialism, the colonialism, used our able-bodied men as just they were surplus, you know, to requirement. So in that respect, as it were, the proliferation of disability, and I assume it's the same in India. Lots of Indians went to fight on behalf of the British. It's not our war, you know, it wasn't our war. We went to fight in the name of the Queen. Why? And they returned disabled, broken, if they didn't have physical disability. And they were, in most instances, as in my grandfather's case, they were not given any medical assistance. PTSD, what Freud would call a shell shock, was a condition that only white soldiers suffered. Black and brown soldiers did not suffer PTSD or shell shock. You know, please don't get me started on that one. So colonialism, we fought for nothing. We fought in their wars. Our men and women, mainly men, returned broken, lost, and so on. And they were returned to the bosoms of their families who were not equipped to deal with conditions that were really medical, serious medical, all over the world, whether in Africa or in India or in the Caribbean. Young men were colonial. So colonialism has a lot to answer.
So this is my last question, which is to do with our pandemic situation. So we are witnessing a resurgence of stigma surrounding disability during this pandemic. So it stretches from the COVID patient to being unholy to untouchable. So why is there a forced fusing, a sort of fusion of disease and disability?
Well, all pandemics have are connected to either ethnicity. So ethnic enclaves are normally connected to pandemics, and also disabled bodies. This is historically, it's always been like that. For example, in China, and this is shocking to all observers, when COVID started, remember the things started from Wuhan, but in China, they immediately targeted African migrants in China. And African migrants, for example, were not allowed to enter shops. They were removed from their housing and so on. Now, the reason for this is shocking. Why? We didn't start. In fact, in Africa, the rates of the disease, the caseload, and the deaths is much lower than anywhere else in the world. Everyone is kind of shocked. The scientists are now jumping up and down. They're trying to find reasons. But in China, they targeted the African community. Why is this? The reason is that, and this is standard, what the Chinese are doing to Africans, they suffered it in the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And that is because typically migrants from different communities outside the dominant are placed, segregated in residential enclaves, partly for surveillance reasons, so they can be seen, and partly to be able to determine, a form of containment. And so it is not unusual for these enclaves also to be tagged with negativity, disease, dirt, unhygienic conditions, and so on. This is historically every slums. So migrants are typically, enclaved in slums and so on and so forth. So what we then see is that the disabled become a placeholder for otherness. And whenever the dominant society is afraid, which COVID has done, people who are considered either marginal or weak are used as the scapegoats. So it's a scapegoating function, that they are either the causes or the reminders of illness. This is historical. Everywhere in the world, it has happened. The COVID itself, in a way, it's forcing a slight, as it were, alteration, because it is no respecter of persons. It doesn't respect poor people or rich people or old people or young people. And yet there's a stubborn, insistence, because societies, when they enter panic mode, are always looking for the weakest link to blame. And that, of course, is regrettable, it's really bad.
Right. Okay. So let's shift to the audience questions. Gokul asks in the chat box, what do you think is the most effective form of representation of disability? Is it the first person mode or the third person mode?
Well, I'm assuming if it says first person, because there's first person fiction and first person biographical. Yeah. I don't think you can adjudicate that easily between effect. It depends on what they're saying and how they're saying it. So you cannot say the disabled person. Let us say I had a disability and I decided to write about my disability as a kind of confessional biography. It's a particular genre and I'll be doing a particular thing and I may decide to say it in a particular way or not. It doesn't follow that because it is the biography of a disabled person, it will be necessarily more effective than in a fictionalized account. I don't think we can make that judgment without knowing what each one is doing. So that's how I would answer it. You can't.
Right. Shomu Chakraborty asks, are there any specific tropes artists or authors follow while representing disability?
Well, for that, you have to read the chapter 2 of my book, because I lay out, I think, 10 or 11 different tropes, and I name them, I tag them, each troop. I cannot go into it right now, but there are troops that authors follow. And sometimes the troops are connected. So it will be one troop to start with, and then it will give up to another troop, and so on. So the answer is yes, you can see certain topological patterns in works on disability. There's the second chapter of my book, you see it.
Okay, Joa Shorkar asks an interesting question. She says that in your book, you write about the oscillation, which, the disability oscillates uneasily between the aesthetic and the ethical domains. So how do you think this oscillation be different in case of disability life writing or in the works of disability performance artists?
Yeah, life writing, the oscillation will be different because life writing is trying to make a particular kind of intervention. I am disabled and I have suffered thus, and I have come to this position, and I want everyone to take note of what a disabled person can do, given the constraints of society and so on and so on. So it has a particular, intervention that it is making. And of course, a performance artist is physically before you. I'm thinking of drama, one person performance artist and so on. The thing is to look at the generic conventions and what specifically they are trying to do. So again, generalization, you cannot generalize without first paying attention to the details. So that in a way, I will have to repeat part of my answer to the previous question. You have to pay attention, close attention to what is being presented before you, and then you make your judgment from that.
Right, so we just have time for one last question. Bhupati asks, Professor Quayson, thank you for your enlightening explanation, of course. And so he asks, don't you think we need to also construct disability aesthetics by centralizing embodiment of the disabled? And of course, the second part is, on a personal note, why did you stop your contribution to disability studies with aesthetic nervousness?
Well, I haven't stopped. I mean, I've written a few things. The chapter in the Beckett chapter is actually a disability studies chapter and so on. I have not continued work in disability studies. That is true. I stand accused. And that is because I'm very restless intellectually. As an intellectual, I'm very restless. And so my mind goes around identifying different kinds of problems. So you see from my books that I have done completely different things. So some people will assume that I'm really an urban studies scholar because I wrote a book that won an award in urban studies. In the urban studies book, there was nothing about this. Actually, there was research on disability in the book, but which I didn't put in because it would have required me to pay a negative attention. I didn't want to say anything negative about disability, so I removed it. But so my retreating from working specifically, the retreat is only temporary because it comes up, or it keeps coming up. I keep being asked, for example, to, if I just I have to reply to a message from a press asking me to blurb a book on disability. So I get that all the time. And of which you're going to give me a copy, obviously, for me to read. But you are right. I haven't continued writing, more books on disability. And part of it is I'm very restless as an intellectual. I'm always moving. The different problems appeal to me. And once the problem seizes my consciousness, I have to sort it out.
Right, okay. Thank you so much, Professor Ato Quayson, for your enthralling reflections on the human condition, on disability, contingency, and problems of representation. Thank you so much.
1 minute before you leave.
Yes.
I've started a YouTube channel called Critic Reading Writing, which I'm typing it here.
Yes, please.
Writing, which I strongly urge you to visit and subscribe. I want people outside the Euro-America to get access to the kinds of thinking that I'm trying to demonstrate in the channel. And at some point, not right now, because I cluster the texts, I'm going to do a whole set of episodes on disability. So disability is definitely coming. And so there'll be a segment on disability. Right now, the segment that I've been working through is on tragedy from different parts of the world. So there's the Greeks. I'm doing a spot on Shakespeare's Othello. It's coming up on Saturday, and so on and so forth. So I urge you all to visit Critic Reading Writing and subscribe and share the word.
Yes, and I'll also mail the link to them.
Please, I've sent it. Yeah.
Yes. Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this question. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Asijit.
We'll have such sessions with you again in the near future.
Thank you.
Yes, and thanks everyone for being so patient and cooperative. Thank you so much. Yes. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.